The peculiar shoe laws of medieval England. Imagine walking down a muddy London street in the late 14th century. The wooden beams of overhanging houses almost touch across the narrow lane, casting it in shadow even at midday. The air smells of damp straw, roasting meat, and the tang of tanneries curing hides along the river. Horses clatter past, their hooves sinking slightly into the soft earth. And yet, what truly catches your attention is not the noise of carts or the cry of vendors, but the shoes people are wearing. These are not the humble leather boots you might expect from peasants trudging home from the fields, nor the sturdy sandals of a monk making his way toward the abbey. No, many men, especially those of wealth, are wearing shoes with extravagantly long, tapering points. These pointed shoes, known as polanes, stretch several inches, sometimes more than a foot, beyond the toes. Some are so long they must be tied to the leg with laces or chains to prevent tripping. To modern eyes, they seem absurd, impractical, even faintly comical. But to a medieval observer, they were the very height of fashion. It was this very fashion that led to what we might call one of the duller curiosities of medieval governance: the shoe laws. Medieval England, like much of Europe, was governed not only by kings and councils, but also by a deep concern with regulating outward appearances. Clothing, jewelry, hats, and yes, even shoes, were subject to rules meant to enforce social order. Why shoes? To understand, we must first place ourselves in a society where class distinctions were everything. Medieval England was rigidly stratified. Lords, knights, clergy, merchants, and peasants all had their place. One's dress was not simply a matter of personal taste. It was a visible statement of status. A man's tunic length, the type of fur on his collar, the width of his belt, the color of his cloak. All were signals to the world of who he was and what he was allowed to be. By the mid-14th, the story of England's shoe laws was never just about footwear. It was about power, obedience, and the subtle dance between rulers and the ruled. In Section 1, we looked at how pointed shoes, polanes, became a craze that worried lawmakers. Now, let us turn to the question of enforcement. How were these rules carried out? Who policed them? And what resistance they met in muddy streets and bustling towns? The machinery of regulation. In medieval England, the task of enforcing such laws fell to a patchwork of local authorities. Sheriffs, mayors, and constables were charged with maintaining order, which often included checking whether citizens followed sumptuary laws, rules regulating clothing, fabrics, jewelry, and, yes, shoe points. Theoretically, if a man of modest station wore shoes too long, he could be fined. Repeat offenders might find their shoes confiscated or cut down in length, quite literally trimmed with knives in the street. Chroniclers tell us of moments where a man's vanity was clipped away by officers eager to make a point, the law reducing leather to compliance. But in practice, enforcement was uneven. London, with its large population and constant influx of merchants, apprentices, and foreigners, struggled to maintain consistency. A constable might look the other way if a wealthy merchant's son strutted past with 12-inch points, but he might scold a journeyman tailor for wearing shoes only slightly longer than permitted. The church's role. It was not only secular law that frowned upon extravagant shoes. The church played its part, too. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the vanity of fashion, pointing to pointed shoes as a symptom of sin. The Archbishop of Canterbury at one point issued stern warnings against them, declaring that such shoes distracted men from piety and prayer. Monks wrote moralistic tales in which long shoes symbolized pride and foolishness. In sermons, clergymen sometimes compared men in polanes to foolish birds with O. By the early 15th century, the craze for pointed shoes was beginning to wane. What had once been the height of fashion, the exaggerated polane with its curling tip, was now gradually giving way to new styles. Laws had played their part, sermons had thundered, but ultimately, It was fashion itself that shifted the tide. No style lasts forever, and even the most ridiculous trends eventually yield to something fresh. The waning of the point. Fashion historians often point to the late 15th century as the moment when pointed shoes began to fall out of favor. In their place rose broader, squarer shoes, sometimes nicknamed duckbills, because of their flat, wide appearance. These were easier to walk in, more practical for muddy streets, and they projected a different kind of status, one that emphasized width and solidity rather than length and delicacy. Why did the point decline? Some suggest that the constant criticism of clergy and lawmakers finally wore down enthusiasm. Others note that military needs changed. A pointed shoe was impractical in armor or on horseback, while a sturdy, square shoe better suited the demands of knights and soldiers. And still others argue that it was simply the natural cycle of fashion. When one extreme has been reached, the pendulum swings the other way. Whatever the cause, the change was visible. By the late 1400s, the absurdly long shoes of the earlier century had become a symbol of outdated vanity. Young men mocked their father's generation, just as new styles often ridicule the old. The afterlife of the laws. With the decline of the point came the decline of the laws that had tried to regulate them. There was no need to fine men for wearing 12-inch shoes when no one wanted them anymore. Sumptuary laws did not vanish entirely, of course. Kings and parliaments continued to legislate fabrics, furs, and jewels. But shoes, once a matter of heated regulation, faded from the legal record. It is striking, however, how these laws left in. The builders of stone walls in Inca villages. Picture yourself standing in the thin mountain air of the Andes. The wind carries the faint scent of smoke from cooking fires, and the sound of distant flutes drifts from a nearby village. Terraces climb the hillsides like green steps, cut into the slopes with a precision that seems almost mathematical. But what draws your eye most is not the fields or the mountains, but the walls. Everywhere you look, there are walls of stone. Massive blocks fitted together so tightly that not even a blade of grass can slip between them. These are not castles, not fortresses in the European sense, but the everyday fabric of Inca villages. Homes, storehouses, and ceremonial centers were all built from stone, a material as abundant as the mountains themselves. And yet, despite their abundance, these stones are anything but crude. They are carefully chosen, shaped, and placed with an artistry that remains astonishing centuries later. Some stones weigh several tons, and yet they rest against one another without mortar, held in place only by their perfect fit. The walls are not uniform. Some blocks are rectangular, others irregular, each nestled against its neighbor like pieces of a puzzle, the work of many hands. The builders of these walls were not professional masons in the modern sense. Rather, they were villagers fulfilling the obligations of MITA, the labor tax that formed the backbone of Inca society. Each household contributed time and effort to state projects, building roads, terraces, temples, or walls. In exchange, the state provided food during lean seasons, protection from enemies, and a sense of belonging to an empire that stretched for thousands of miles. So, the man you see lifting stones may be a farmer most of the year, tending maize or potatoes. For several weeks, though, he labors on construction, joining his neighbors in a communal rhythm of lifting, shaping, and fitting. Women and children often assist by carrying. We left the village in the Andes at twilight, the walls half-finished and the workers resting after a long day of lifting and fitting stone. Now let us step back and look at how such work was organized, how an empire without wheels or writing on paper managed to build so much, and what this meant for the lives of the people who carried stones until their hands blistered. The framework of the MITA. At the heart of Inca labor was the MITA, often translated as a labor tax. Unlike coin or grain, this tax was measured in days of work. Each household, depending on size and strength, contributed a certain number of workers to state projects. It was not slavery in the strictest sense, for the laborers were not owned, and they returned to their fields afterward. But it was compulsory, and it tied every family directly to the empire. The MITA was overseen by local officials known as Caracas, men drawn from the community who acted as intermediaries between villagers and the imperial administrators. They kept track of who had fulfilled obligations, who owed work, and how many days were spent quarrying, farming state lands, or building roads. Imagine the scene. A group of villagers is called forward in the plaza. Names are recited from memory by officials who used quipu, knotted strings that recorded numbers and categories, as their ledgers. No parchment, no ink, but knots of colored wool strung together to ensure no one could escape their share. Those chosen packed their tools, food, and bedding, then marched together to the worksite. The rhythm of organization. At the wall, work was divided into teams. Some fetched stones from nearby quarries. Others chipped away with hammering stones, shaping edges. A different group hauled the blocks on sledges or logs, while the most skilled fitted the stones into place. Each step required precision, not haste. Supervisors circulated among the workers, ensuring the rhythm did not falter. Orders were not barked in anger, but the what. We have followed the Inca villagers as they shaped, hauled, and fitted stones under the watchful eye of officials, bound by the labor tax that tied them to the empire. Now, let us look beyond the act of building to the fate of these walls. How they endured invasion, weather, and time itself, and what they reveal to us centuries later as silent witnesses of human persistence. Stones against the earth. When you walk through the Andes today, you can still place your hand against walls laid more than 500 years ago. The stones are cool, their edges softened by time yet still tightly joined, no mortar crumbling between them. In villages, terraces, and fortresses alike, the pattern holds. Irregular blocks interlocked like a puzzle, their joints so precise that grass cannot grow between them. Earthquakes shake these mountains often, yet the walls hold steady. Colonial buildings erected on top of them cracked and toppled, while the Inca foundations endured. Spanish chroniclers themselves admitted the remarkable resilience of these walls, marveling at a people they otherwise sought to dismiss as uncivilized. This endurance was not an accident. It was born of careful craft. Each stone was slightly angled, each joint tapered inward, so that when the earth moved, the stones pressed tighter together. Builders who spent their lives fitting stone upon stone may not have had formulas or blueprints, but they had instinct born of repetition, a knowledge carried in calloused hands. The arrival of the Spanish. When Spanish soldiers entered the Andes in the 16th century, they were struck by the sight of Inca architecture. Fortresses such as Sacsayhuaman near Cusco rose in massive tiers, each stone larger than a man. In towns and villages, neat walls supported terraces and homes. The invaders saw not just stone but order, an empire disciplined enough to mobilize thousands for building projects. The Spanish quickly claimed these walls for themselves. Churches were built,